In the spring of 1894, a man named Clay Macaulay sat in a room in Washington and wrote something he could not fully explain. Macaulay was not a mystic. He was an ethnographer, methodical, credentialed. The kind of man who counted chickens in a Seminole village and recorded the number in a government report. He had spent months in the Florida interior in the early 1880s, documenting what remained of the Seminole people after 3 wars and a century of removal campaigns had reduced a nation of thousands to fewer than 250 souls living in the deep swamps of the Everglades. He had written everything down: the population figures, the agricultural practices, the clan structures, the material culture, everything the Bureau of Ethnology asked him to record. But there was one category of his notes he had never submitted. He held it for more than a decade, and in 1894, apparently believing he was near the end of his life. He was wrong about that, as it turned out, but he believed it. He wrote a letter to a colleague at the Smithsonian describing what the Seminole elders had told him, in confidence, about the springs. I came to this the way I come to nearly everything, through a footnote somebody else considered minor. I was reading the published version of Macaulay's 1887 Bureau of Ethnology report on the Seminole, a document that is meticulous and thorough and, in one specific place, conspicuously incomplete. He describes the freshwater springs of the Florida interior as places of significance to the Seminole people. He notes their ritual dimension, and then, in a passage that reads like a man stopping himself mid-sentence, he writes that the elders declined to elaborate and that he did not press them. I have read a great many ethnographic reports from that era, and I cannot recall another moment where a researcher of Macaulay's training simply put down his pen and moved on. They did not do that. They pressed. They translated. They triangulated from other informants. Macaulay did not. And the 1894 letter, which I located in the Smithsonian Institution archives in a folder of Macaulay correspondence that had not been opened since 1931, explains why. By the time this reaches you, you will understand what the Seminole elders knew about those underwater cave systems that Macaulay spent 13 years deciding whether to put on paper, and why the knowledge they held, if it had been fully recorded and circulated, would have rewritten what we thought we knew about who lived in Florida, and for how long. Consider the cave systems themselves, because most people do not understand what is actually beneath Florida's surface. Florida sits atop one of the most extensive karst limestone formations in the world. Rainwater, moving through that limestone for millions of years, has carved hundreds of miles of submerged tunnel networks, many of them interconnected. Many of them penetrating far below the surface of the peninsula. The springs, Silver Springs, Wakula Springs, Ikitokni, the Blue Hole, dozens of others, are where those underwater systems surface. The water coming up through them is ancient. Some of it fell as rain thousands of years ago, filtered down through the limestone, and has been moving underground ever since. The cave systems connected to these springs are vast in ways that surface maps do not convey. Wakula Springs alone connects to a documented cave system that has been partially mapped by technical divers, with passages running for miles into the earth, passages decorated with stalactites and stalagmites that stopped forming thousands of years ago, which tells you something important. Those formations require air to grow. They grew when those caves were dry. And they were dry at a time when the people we call Paleo-Indians were walking across Florida. Not near Florida, across Florida. The sea level was lower, considerably lower, during the late Pleistocene, and the Florida peninsula was twice its current width. Springs that now bubble up into rivers were at that time openings in a dry landscape. The cave systems connected to them were not flooded. They were accessible. And the archaeological record inside those cave systems, recovered by divers working since the 1970s, is one of the most important and least discussed bodies of evidence in North American prehistory. Mastodon bones, giant ground sloth remains. The skull of a Paleo-Indian human, found in Warm Mineral Springs in 1959, carbon dated to approximately 10,000 years before the present. A wooden mortar and pestle recovered from Little Salt Spring, dated to between 9 and 12,000 years old. Still usable, still showing tool marks. These were not people passing through. These were people living here, using these spring systems, understanding their layout, returning to them across generations. And that last point, returning to them across generations, is the part that matters for what comes later. Because repeated return implies spatial knowledge. It implies that someone knew which spring led to which passage led to water safe to drink, which chamber was large enough to shelter in during the dry season when the landscape above offered very little. The springs were not just scenery. They were infrastructure. For a people living on a peninsula with no significant mountain ranges and no reliable surface rivers during certain seasons, the spring systems and the underground networks feeding them were as important as any road would be to a later civilization. You do not survive in that landscape across multiple generations without understanding its hidden geometry, and you do not maintain that understanding without finding a way to encode and transmit it. This is the part I keep returning to. The Seminole people did not arrive in Florida as strangers. That is the popular framing. The Seminole as a relatively recent formation. A confederacy of Creek and other displaced southeastern peoples who moved into Florida in the 18th century after the earlier indigenous populations had been devastated by Spanish contact and disease. That is true, as far as it goes. But it does not account for what the elders told Macaulay, because what Macaulay recorded in that 1894 letter was not a description of 18th century oral tradition. It was a description of knowledge that the elders themselves identified as coming from people before their people, a phrase that Macaulay rendered in careful quotation, noting that it was a specific and deliberate distinction the elder he spoke with drew repeatedly. Not their ancestors. The people before their ancestors. The elder in question, Macaulay identifies only by a clan designation, not a personal name. He explains in the letter that the man had asked not to be named, that the information was being shared on those terms, and that Macaulay had given his word. What the elder described was a network of passages beneath the springs that his people understood as a living thing, as something that breathed, that filled and emptied in rhythms connected to rainfall and to seasons and to cycles longer than a single human life. He described specific springs as entrances. He described the water that came up through them as having properties that varied depending on which deep passage it had traveled through, and how long it had been underground. He described knowing which passage led where, not from personal exploration, but from knowledge transmitted over generations in a specific form, a song cycle, particular to the clan of keepers responsible for maintaining it, that encoded the geography of the underground system in a sequence of images and sounds that could be performed from memory, and that contained, for someone trained to read it, a navigational map. A navigational map of a submerged cave system, maintained in oral form across generations by a people who, their elders said, had inherited it from people before their people. I want to stay with that for a moment, because it is easy to hear that phrase and dismiss it as the kind of deep-time mythological language all oral traditions use. The ancestors of the ancestors, the time before the first people, the vague and distant past. But Macaulay was an experienced ethnographer who had spent years working with indigenous oral traditions, and he specifically notes in his 1894 letter that what struck him about the way the elder framed this was its precision. The elder was not describing a mythological time. He was describing a distinct historical period, identifiable by specific conditions, a time when the springs looked different, when the water table was lower, when certain passages that were now submerged could be entered from the surface. He described this not as legend, but as the factual basis for why the song cycle was structured the way it was, why certain passages in it described conditions that no longer existed above the waterline. The song had been preserved accurately, the elder explained, even as the landscape it described had changed, because the knowledge of what was down there did not change just because the water had risen over the entrance. The question is not whether the Seminole had sophisticated knowledge of the springs. The ethnographic record is unambiguous on that point. The springs were central to Seminole ceremonial life, to medicine, to the clan knowledge held by specific families. The question is how old that knowledge was and what it described. And that is the question the elder answered in 1894 to a man sitting with a notebook in a swamp, in confidence, because the elder had decided, Macaulay writes, that the time had come for at least one record to exist outside his people, given what he understood was happening to his people. There is a detail in the letter I have not been able to explain away. The elder described, as part of the song cycle's encoded geography, a passage that descended to a place where the cave opened into a large underground space. The word Macaulay uses is chamber, and he notes that the elder used a Muskogee term he translated roughly as the room beneath the room. In that chamber, the elder said, the people before his people had placed things. Objects, he described them as heavy, as made of material that did not decay, as intentionally arranged rather than casually deposited. He did not describe them further, or if he did, Macaulay did not write it down, and I think Macaulay made a deliberate choice there, honoring the boundary the elder had drawn. But he wrote enough. Because in 1987, a team of cave divers from Florida State University, exploring a deep section of the Wakulla Springs cave system, reached a large subterranean chamber at approximately 90 feet of depth, in a section of the cave that had not been previously accessed. They documented what they found in a report that was submitted to the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research and that has been publicly available since 1989. The report describes the chamber. It describes sediment disturbance patterns inconsistent with natural water movement. And it describes, in the careful language of professional archaeologists trained not to overstate, anomalous concentrations of dense material along the chamber walls that could not be attributed to geological process, and that were not further excavated due to the technical limitations of the dive. Not further excavated. Because the technical limitations were real, 90 feet of depth, in a flooded limestone chamber with zero visibility in the sediment, but also because the report notes, in its final paragraph, that the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research had been contacted regarding jurisdictional questions about the site and had not yet responded with guidance. The follow-up dive was scheduled for 1988. It did not happen. The funding for the Wakulla Springs Cave Survey Project was redirected in the 1988 state budget cycle to a different archaeological priority. The chamber has not been formally re-entered since. I want to be precise about what I am and am not saying here. I am not saying that chamber contains what the elder described to Macaulay. I am saying that an elder described a specific geographic feature of a specific cave system in 1894. A large underground chamber reachable through a descending passage, and that in 1987. Divers found a large underground chamber in that cave system, reachable through a descending passage, and found in it material evidence of human activity, and then did not go back. I am saying that I have put those two documents next to each other, and I cannot explain away what I see. The knowledge the Seminole elders held about these systems was not incidental. It was structured, it was encoded, it was protected, and it was selectively transmitted. Macaulay understood this, which is why he held his notes for 13 years. He was not afraid of ridicule. He was a government scientist, and he dealt in data. He was afraid of something more specific. He writes in the 1894 letter that he was uncertain what publication of this information would produce, given the history of how such knowledge had been received and acted upon. Given the history. He was writing in 1894, 6 years after the Dawes Act had begun systematically dismantling indigenous land tenure across the country, 4 years after Wounded Knee. He knew what happened when the federal government learned that an indigenous people held specific, detailed knowledge of a specific piece of land. He had watched it happen for a decade. So he wrote one letter to one trusted colleague, and he asked that colleague to hold it until the time seemed right. The colleague held it until he died in 1921. His estate gave Macaulay's papers to the Smithsonian. They were catalogued. The folder was filed. And then, for 70 years, it sat. This was not the only case where Seminole oral knowledge of the underwater cave systems was documented, and then quietly set aside. In 1906, a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent named William Bomer submitted a report on the southern Seminole that included, in an appendix, accounts from several Seminole men of specific spring locations that the agent noted were described as entrances to underground routes connecting distant points on the peninsula. Bomer flagged this in his report as potentially significant for surveying purposes. He was thinking practically, as government agents did, and recommended that a formal inquiry be made. The formal inquiry was never made. Bomer's appendix is rarely cited even by scholars who work extensively with biorecords from that period. In 1933, an anthropologist named Ethel Cutler Freeman spent several months with Seminole families in the Everglades and recorded, in her field notes deposited at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, references to spring knowledge held by specific clan lineages that she described as surprisingly detailed and surprisingly consistent across different informants who had not consulted with each other. She noted she was not qualified to evaluate the geographical specifics and suggested that a geographer or hydrologist be consulted. No geographer or hydrologist was consulted. 3 separate researchers, spanning 30 years, each touching the edge of the same body of knowledge, each noting its significance, each recommending follow-up that never came. That is not disorganization. That is the rhythm of information that no institution has a strong incentive to pursue. Consider what pursuit would have required. A geologist with deep knowledge of Florida's karst systems, a hydrologist familiar with the spring basin connections, a technical diver with the training to access submerged chambers, an ethnomusicologist capable of working with the Muskogee language and analyzing the structure of the song cycles. And, most critically, Seminole elders willing to share that song cycle knowledge with outside researchers at a moment in history when sharing any traditional knowledge with the United States government had, for 3 generations, resulted in land loss, forced relocation, or worse. The institutional machinery to assemble such a team and earn that trust did not exist in 1906 or 1933, and it barely exists today. So the knowledge sat in the folders, and the cave stayed sealed. What we lost, what we have not yet fully recovered, and may not, is the oldest continuous geographic knowledge of the Florida underwater cave systems that exists anywhere on Earth. The Seminole elders who held it were the inheritors of a tradition that may have stretched back, if the people before their people reference means what Macaulay's elder implied it meant, to a time when those caves were dry, when the coastline of Florida was 60 miles further out to sea, when the springs were openings in a terrestrial landscape that people walked through and camped beside and used as landmarks. The technical divers who have mapped portions of those systems since the 1970s are extraordinary in their skill and courage. But they are mapping geometry. The Seminole song cycles, if they still exist in any form, encoded something the geometry alone cannot tell you. The meaning of what is down there, who put it there, and why. That knowledge lived in specific people, in specific clans, transmitted in a specific form that required proximity and ceremony and time to pass on. And those people spent the 19th and 20th centuries surviving removal, epidemic, poverty, and forced assimilation in ways that did not leave much room for the careful transmission of deep cave geography to the next generation. The elder who spoke to Macaulay in the 1880s told him, near the end of their conversations, that he was not certain the songs had been passed on correctly. Not lost, he did not say lost, not certain. That single word, rendered in Macaulay's careful handwriting in a letter that sat in a folder for 70 years, is the saddest thing I have read in a long time. If you know someone who has stood at a Florida spring and felt something they couldn't name, something older than the tourism signs and the glass-bottom boats and the manicured river walks, share this with them. The water coming up through those springs is ancient. The knowledge of where it comes from was more ancient still.